So this is the breakdown of the data between which category of firms have patentees and downstream manufacturers. So I'll skip this slide, but for your reference. And this is the chart that compares the revenues of downstream manufacturers in blue and patentees in orange. Is that it? But you see that the revenues of manufacturers grew much faster than those of patentees. And the profit margin lines are flat as they were in the different component segments. For patentees, no growth in profit margins. For manufacturers, almost no growth in profit margins. It's a very competitive industry, lot of entry, lot of exit, and growing very fast. I'll stop here. Just wanted to share this data and say that we live in this world where IP rights has enabled this industry to grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cardi. Our next panelist is Bruce Kobayashi of George Mason Law School.
All right, well, I want to thank Richard for giving most of my content at lunch. So, I'll make it interesting, and obviously I agree with a lot of things he said. I'm going to talk about performing rights organizations as a Kosian firm. So he covered Coase 1937 article, and he answered a question about PROs. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about antitrust and disagree with him just to make it exciting. And as Richard said, Coase had not only the 1960 paper, but early on in his career, part of his dissertation, I believe, he wrote a paper in Economica on the theory of the firm in 1937. And if I go home and tell my mother what this paper's about, it's that people form organizations and use these organizations to organize production when it makes sense to. That's the profound insight of Coase. But it was a profound insight in the sense that if you thought about what economists did with general equilibrium models and mathematical models, we had the Walrasian auctioneer, and everything was a black box and some frictionless markets. And it's hard to figure out why we have firms in that setting, which only exists and lives somewhere in a blackboard. So Coase basically tried to bring us out of the blackboard, and it really was a profound insight. And he discusses some of the costs of using a market transactions. So why do you make instead of just buy? Well, there are costs of discovering market prices, and there are costs of negotiating a contract for each exchange transaction. The theory has been extended. Alchin and Demsetz have, extended this theory of the firm. Klein, Crawford, and Alchin Williamson famously looked at reasons for vertical integration. There's actually a nice paper by Sen, who actually was a master's student at the Northwestern Music School, and then he went to law school. But he's saying, look, in the U.S., we have performance rights. But before Congress created digital performance rights for sound recordings, they only went to songwriters. And so what should happen if you only have performance rights and the only people who get paid are songwriters and not performance rights for sound recordings? Well, you should get more vertical integration between singers and songwriters. And so he documents the empirical rise of the singer-songwriter. So those questions are all sort of Coase theory of the firm organizations. And it's not just firms versus markets. Paul Rubin has a famous piece which sort of kicked off the economic study of franchise organizations. McDonald's, Burger King, and the like. And what I thought I would do for this session was to look at performing rights organizations, which in some sense are they're a hybrid organization, right? As Richard said, what they do is they reduce transactions costs, right? BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC in the US, they're all over the world. And Landis and Posner actually have a brief description in their seminal 1989 piece on the economic analysis of copyright, and they say, these organizations are a market response to copyright problems caused by high transactions costs. So, it seems like they're the quintessential Cozy and 37 firm or organization. The number of users of copyrighted music makes individual negotiations with individual copyright holders to acquire performance infeasible. And so these organizations arise in the face of those transactions costs of using the market. Right? There's more to that. Of course, they also eliminate sort of the costs of the monitoring and what song is played, and the individual costs of contracting by, they use a blanket license, so you basically license the rights to the whole repertoire. And they're responsible for distributing license fees net of costs to songwriters and publishers. So, they basically go out and figure out who played what, and then distribute those royalties to the songwriters. And so, without, this is my graphical version of transactions costs. It's a web of transactions without the PROs, and it gets much simpler with them. I know that's incorrect, but I'll fix it. I was doing this on the train, and I got tired of dragging arrows. All right. If you're a musician, or if you're a composer, you basically sign up with one of these. And so these guys, like Bar Louie or individual radio stations, would have to get 3 licenses from each of the performing rights organizations if they thought that they wanted to perform songs in the individual repertoires, right? So now, for people who, this is probably a very sophisticated audience, but the performance right that's collected by BMI, ASCAP, and CSAC is the right of performance for the underlying work, right? It's not for the sound recording. So I was going to actually do a performance on my phone, and I hope I don't get in trouble, right? But fair use, educational fair use. This is John Coltrane's famous version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's My Favorite Things. And John Coltrane and the record company, I think this is a Prestige recording or Blue Note. They don't get a dime, right, if the radio station plays it. I should just let this go because it's 12 minutes long. Right? And when the song ends, my talk is over. Yeah, it goes to the composer or the publishing house who owns the rights to the underlying composition. So you have these organizations that collect and monitor these royalties, right? They do not collect the songwriter publishers' mechanical royalties. There's other organizations, Harry Fox Agency, that does that. They do not collect the digital performance royalties. They're collected by a different organization called Sound Exchange. And in other countries, you have hybrids that have bigger roles or multiple roles. And the other thing, and this is where I want to sort of address Richard, is that BMI and ASCAP are under 2 1941 consent decrees that I think were last modified a long time ago. Actually, the DOJ has a very recent rulemaking which they've asked for comments on whether they should be amended. And CSAC is not under any consent decree, but they're much smaller. And so if you think about a coding organization, I mean, Richard talked about a lot of different types of organization and your choice of pricing. Here, the choice of pricing is dictated by a 1941 consent decree. It's a long time ago, right? Right before World War II. And it's administered by the Southern District of New York as a rate court when you don't have an agreement, right? That's hardly, market price or market pricing. Now, Richard said, look, I'm going to leave, if we have antitrust problems, I'm going to leave that as the residual. But it's antitrust not as Denise Coate would do it, but as he would do it. But, we don't have that world of Richard Epstein antitrust anymore. I mean, it's certainly not here, and certainly not in, you know, the other countries. So we do have to sort of worry about this process of setting prices, right? I mean, usually when you form a closing firm, you bring in, you know, transfer pricing or something. You do it because it's more efficient. Here we have a system which is made for old-style collection from bars playing the radio and from terrestrial radio. And these consent decrees restrict what ASCAP and BMI do. They don't let them get beyond the business model they have. And they assign the SDNY as a rate court to arbitrate failed negotiations over how much the license will cost. DOJ is looking at it. One of the things they're looking at is whether they should allow ASCAP and BMI to allow rights holders to withdraw rights for some types of users. Which users are those? Well, they're users who are like Pandora, right? Where, as Richard said, it's a much different type of transaction, right? It's very easy to figure out what they pay. There's not that many of them. And you could do direct licensing. It would be the purple, right? You could also basically use Sound Exchange or, you know, something like Sound Trust. You don't even have to use ASCAP if you don't want to. And what Sony and Warner and Universal suggested is they wanted to carve out their digital rights, right? And they're bypassing ASCAP. What they're also bypassing is the rate courts, right? But they were going to leave, you know, when they wanted to collect from the local bar or a terrestrial radio station, they were going to leave those rights in ASCAP. And what the rate court did, they said, we looked at the consent decree from 1941, and it does not allow partial withdrawals. So what do you get? Well, you get sort of a Hobson's choice, right? All or nothing. You're in or you're out. And so if they get out, what's going to happen? You're going to get back to the web, right? These bars are going to play songs, and they may not be in the repertoire, right? They're going to be out, and so they're going to have to get individual licenses from the songwriters and publishers. Pandora can have will have to have direct negotiations with the publishers, but we'll still have to get some kind of partial license for the residual things that are left in ASCAP. So what's going to happen? Well, you're probably going to even further speed the demise of the traditional performance right industry, performance right organizations, if you sort of don't fix the ability to opt out. You're going to certainly raise the transactions cost for the traditional users back to sort of, you know, a balkanized performance rights organizations plus individual licenses. And you're really preventing the use of a more efficient alternative to price determination through the consent decree.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Our next speaker is Kristen Osinga from the University of Richmond School of Law. Go Spiders!
Bruce, did you have a clicker? Oh. You did.
He does that all the time.
I thought only people at my school did that. Okay, so first I want to thank Adam and Mark for having me here. I'm going to talk about one type of firm in particular that's a big part of the innovation and creative industries. And I'm going to call them licensing-based business models. You may guess where this is going. They have other names. And I'm going to talk about why calling them those other names is actually causing more of a problem than it should, and why we should maybe think about calling them something different. So quick overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you all a very, very, very quick review of patent trolls. I'm going to try not to use that word because it's a bad word. And you people know what they do, but just so that I can frame up what I want to say about them, I'm just going to go through it quickly. Then I want to talk about what I want to talk about, which is looking behind that label. If we get rid of the patent troll label, what's underneath? and I think what's underneath is not what people expect, which is why I think we need to get rid of the label, call them licensing-based business models, and look at what those firms actually do and don't do. So I looked at a couple of them. I'm going to tell you what I found out, and then I'm going to wrap up by telling you how I think that calling them names actually obscures the benefits. So patent trolls. There, I said it one more time. That's it. I'm done. I generally want to avoid that term, like I said. Patent troll is just an ugly word, and I'm Norwegian and I like trolls, but that just doesn't really capture the reality of what's going on. And as some of the previous panels mentioned, how big a problem it is really a problem because of definition, okay? Is it a big problem? Is it not a big problem? One of the reasons that we don't know how big a problem it is, if it's even a problem, is that nobody defines it the same way, okay? And here's just a quick little graphic. Colleen Chen, based on what she defines as that kind of business model, finds a lot more lawsuits attributable to them than the GAO does, because they have a different definition. So we have a term that people can't even agree what it means, in part because it's just a name that they throw onto things. So because there's a problem in the definition, it leads to problems about what the scope is. How big is the scope of the problem? We don't really know. Now, this is the only picture you're going to get from me. I'm not cool like Bruce and have all these like lines and arrows and stuff, so look at it now because there's not going to be any more pictures, sorry. The other problem with the definition and with the name itself is that it doesn't carry any information. It ignores the issues that underlie it. It's just a name. There are problems, I will give you that. There's definitely some problems that go on right now in particular patent litigation, but those problems have nothing to do with the name, right? The problems has to do with the behavior, and the behavior and how we define that name aren't necessarily related. So, here we go. Now, what if we look behind the label, okay? What if we branch out from the what is their name, how bad are they, etc., and actually look at the companies that are getting the label? Does anybody ever do that? No, they don't. I did. Okay, so I want to peek or peer or whatever word you want to use behind the curtain and look at some of these license-based business models to figure out what they really do, what they don't do, whether they are a problem, and what we can do better. Okay, just as a heads up for those of you in the audience that are starting to get nervous, they are not as big a problem as we think they are. Okay, they're actually good. Okay, and that's the end of my story. You don't need to hear anymore, right? Okay, don't put up the stop on me. Okay, so one important thing when you start looking behind the companies looking behind the label into the companies is you realize that they are not homogeneous. There is differences between them. They come from different places, they do different things, okay? And so when I was looking into some of these companies, those are the two questions I really started thinking about. How did they get there, okay? Not all companies are born as licensing-based business models. Some of them started as something else and had to change their business model for one reason or another. Some of them started as licensing-based business models, and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But they're not all the same in that respect. The other thing that they're not all the same in is what they do. Some of these licensing-based business models only license. Okay, fine. Some of the licensing-based business models have a licensing arm, and they also have a research and development arm. Pretty cool. Okay? And then, heaven forbid, some of these licensing-based business models actually still make stuff, but we're just putting that label on them because we don't like them. Okay? But they actually still make stuff, which is a little weird. But that's okay. So all of these companies have a very different basis from how they got to be who they are and what they do now. And that's something that we're not seeing just by popping the label on top of them. So what I did was this. I did a case study of a couple of different licensing-based business models to look at the questions that I was interested in. How did they get there, and what do they do now? Because I thought maybe if we look at that, we might be able to learn a little bit of something. And I picked one particular type of licensing-based business model, because there's a bunch of them out there, and I have, I have to produce these papers because my dean gets mad if I don't. So I picked a small set to start with, although I'd like to look at a bigger set at some point. But the set I picked was what I like to call the formerly manufacturing entity. These are companies that started as manufacturing firms, and for one reason or another have now moved to more of a licensing-based business model. Okay? One prime example, one of the companies that I looked at is Conversant. Used to be Mosaic, semiconductor maker. Now they're largely a licensing-based business model. Okay, so that's one of them. Another company that I looked at was Sovereign Software. They're one of the mislabeled, possibly, licensing-based business models. They do still make some stuff. But again, they started off as something different, and now they're formerly manufacturing entities. And so I looked at these companies, I looked at how they became what they are, and what do they still do. So with all the ones I looked at, they did used to be something else. None of them were ab initio licensing-based business models, but how they became licensing-based business models is really different. Some of them became licensing-based business models in the face of unchecked infringement. There was nothing they could do to stop infringers from infringing their intellectual property. They couldn't. And so they had to move to more of a proactive licensing-based business model in order to avoid the infringement and losing their market share that way. Some of them moved to a licensing-based business model because the environment had changed. Whereas once they were the only party in the market doing that sort of activity, now there's a whole host of them in the market doing that sort of activity, and so they needed to shift what they were doing. And some of them, it just became non-financially feasible anymore. Okay? So there was a number of reasons why they shifted, but something happened, and they turned from a manufacturing entity into a formerly manufacturing entity. Then I also looked at what they do now. Okay? Some of them, well, most of them, all of them, I guess, of the case study. I can't speak for the ones I didn't study, but of the ones that I studied, they are still developing innovative technology. Every single one of them that I was looking at is developing and or supporting innovative, inventive technology. They're not just licensing only, they're also doing something else. And as I said, some of them are mislabeled and actually are still manufacturing this innovative technology. So what I found in looking at them is that there are a number of really positive aspects that are obscured by the name calling. Okay? And that's the key piece that I want to talk about. So this is where, cool. This is the key piece, and I'm in a good place for it. So what did I learn? What can you learn by what I learned? How about that? I learned so you don't have to. First of all, formerly manufacturing entities still commercialize innovative technology. We hear all the time that those companies, they hinder innovation, that they're a drain on society. Some president may have said that they hijack and extort good companies. I don't know who that was. But they do something. They commercialize. Now, they first started out, these companies I was studying, started out commercializing the technology themselves. That's why I started with the formerly manufacturing entity. They used to actually commercialize their own technology. Now, they commercialize their technology in a different way as an intermediary. They license their technology to somebody else who is going to make it for them. Okay? And I will argue for you that they are actually probably better intermediaries because they were formerly manufacturing. They know the costs of commercializing their technology because they had done it. They know the costs and they know the risks. And in fact, they know the downfalls. In fact, that's why a lot of them actually got out of the industry themselves. It's because they were doing it and ran into some problems, and they're well aware of those. And so when it comes to evaluating their technology, they're in a better position than a lot of licensing companies because they have done the work themselves once. Okay? So they know the risks, they know the costs, they're better intermediaries. Third, I can count. Third, these formerly manufacturing entities often are, and all of them still were or had been, part of a business industry. They all were there. Conversant, when they were Mosaic, was in the semiconductor industry. They operated with other semiconductor companies. And I say that this actually puts them in a place where some of the negative things that we think about, I'm going to say it, patent trolls, aren't true necessarily for them. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. The couple of things that we say about patent trolls, oh God, I'm going to keep saying it. The things that we say, things that they say, I don't say. The things that they say about these companies is that they don't worry about what other companies think of them because they're not going to have a lawsuit. The worst thing that can happen to them is that their patents are found invalid, but they'll just go buy up other patents and assert those. So that's what they do. They have no scruples. They hide under bridges. They delay. Am I missing anything? I think that's about all of it, right? Anyway, that's what those companies do. I think that we can make an argument that formerly manufacturing entities don't do that because they have been in that industry. And because they were in the industry, they didn't start off as a licensing-based business model, not that there's anything wrong with those. They have business ethos and cultural norms. The companies that I studied, 201, all maintain some of the original employees of the manufacturing entity. Those engineers didn't just go turn into bad people because they shifted their business model. Okay? They still think about and act as though they're part of the industry, not that they're apart from the industry. And because they are part of the industry and because they're still developing technology for those industries, there are repercussions if they behave badly. Okay? They're still developing technology that they're hoping other people in that industry will pick up and use, and so there are repercussions other than, oh, their patent might be found invalid. Okay? And then finally, because they were manufacturing a lot of that technology themselves before they had to change their business model, they are not hiding under a bridge hoping to trap the unwary. The technology's out there. Okay, so here we go. My last slide and my last minute. So, licensing based business models are more complex than the name gives them credit for. We got to look behind the name to the companies themselves to see what's actually going on. Even within one type of license-based business model, and there's multiple types of licensing-based business models, even looking at one, the formerly manufacturing entity, we can see that there's a million differences. What they do now, how they got there, etc. So we can't lump them all into one category, okay? There are a lot of good aspects to the backgrounds and the current activities of these licensing-based business models, and the concerns that are currently driving the law reform and policy discussions about these companies are not based in reality, particularly with respect to one type, the formerly manufacturing entity, and I'm guessing with others too if we get rid of the name. And I'm just going to let it go there because I'm out of time. Ah, see, perfect. I'm good, aren't I?
Perfect. Thank you very much. Ben Scheffner is our next speaker from the Motion Picture Association.
First, I want to thank Adam and Mark for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I was a little bit nervous about doing this, speaking to largely a group of economists. I'm not an economist, but Adam reassured me that I would not have to speak about Professor Coase even once. And I appreciate Bruce taking care of that for me. Maybe he can put a little bit of theory behind the facts that I'm going to lay out here. So I go to a lot of copyright conferences, and most of the discussion at these conferences is about sort of things going wrong in copyright. They're about litigation. They're about interesting cases. Where is fair use headed these days? Where is the case law headed? How is secondary liability handled by the courts? But today I'm going to do something a bit different, which is talking about how copyright actually works in the real world. Not when it's infringed, but where it serves the purpose that we intended, which is that it provides incentives for creativity. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how movie studios actually do that and the role that copyright plays in their business activities and the way that they're actually structured. So speaking at a very high level, there's been essentially two models for how movie studios have been organized. The first one was from the 1920s through the 50s, known as the studio system, sometimes also called the golden age of movie studios. And essentially back then, what you had is the studios acting as one-stop shops. They essentially employed everyone who was involved in making and distributing movies. They either employed or held under long-term contracts the actors, the writers, as well as all the what we call below-the-line people, the gaffers and riggers and lighting people and people who built the sets, etc. And this was a very successful time for the movie industry. Just to give you a sense of sort of how movies and the motion picture experience sort of dominated the cultural landscape back then. In 1930, an average of 80 million people in this country would go to the movies every single week. That was about 65% of the overall population of the US. By contrast, in the year 2000, the number was about 27 million Americans would go to a movie theater every week, or about 9.7% of the population. It also produced a lot of creativity. 1939 is often seen as the sort of the apogee of the motion picture industry. That was the year that movie studios put out Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, all in 1939. Well, that era, of course, didn't last forever. One of the major reasons was that the Justice Department in those days wasn't run by Richard Epstein. It was run by people who didn't think it was a very good idea for the studios to be owning the means of distribution, namely movie theaters. It used to be, of course, that Paramount and Fox, et cetera, owned the movie theaters. Well, the Justice Department didn't think that was a very good idea, didn't think it was very pro-consumer, and they went to court and essentially forced the studios, most of the studios, into a consent decree. And then in 1948, a case called United States versus Paramount went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the court essentially said, you can't own the movie theaters anymore, you have to divest yourself of those, and you can't engage in certain forms of exclusivity in your distribution practices. So what do we have now? From the 50s through essentially the present, we have a system that's much more broken up, much more dominated by individuals and outsiders rather than the studios themselves. The studios themselves often do not make the movies. Instead, they engage an outside independent production company, which may have a long-term arrangement with a studio, but it's actually a separate entity. And just some examples that you may have heard of, Jim Cameron, who was mentioned at one of the earlier panels, he has something called Lightstorm. J.J. Abrams has Bad Robot. Steven Spielberg has Amblin Entertainment. So when those are the companies that actually hire the actors and the directors, et cetera, to make an individual movie. And I should say that each individual movie is often made through a corporate entity that's sort of ad hoc and exists only for purposes of making that particular movie. The other thing that's different, of course, is since the studios don't actually own the movie theaters, which have the direct relationship with the consumers, studios rarely these days have an actual direct relationship with the consumers. Instead, the studios deal with a variety of different distributors, including theatrical exhibitors, MVPDs, which are essentially cable and satellite firms, new digital platforms like Netflix. But of course, the studio still performs crucial roles. And let me just spend a couple minutes telling you what exactly those are these days. I think it's summed up by best by an author named Edward J. Epstein, who wrote a very, an excellent book that I recommend. It's a short sort of summary of how Hollywood works from an economic perspective. And he says essentially the studios have two principal assets. They say, one, he acknowledges the intellectual property, which is of course important, but it's really the human capital, which includes the executives with the negotiating skills, judgment, charm, and goodwill within the industry to get the top stars, make the favorable production deals with those independent producers that I just talked about, and profitably organize the release of those movies. So let me just walk through some of the functions, again, that a studio actually performs. Possibly most important is they assemble the financing. The average studio film in the mid-2000s cost on average about $137 million to produce, market, and distribute globally. So where does that money actually come from? There's a few different options that major studios have. One, they can self-finance. They can simply write a check. These are big corporations that have a big treasury, and they can write a check. But of course, they don't know which movies are actually going to make any money. I think Troy in his presentation earlier mentioned that it really only about 2 out of 10 movies actually make the money, so they have an interest in spreading the risk. So they bring in a number of outside players to actually finance their films. One is they get money from hedge funds here in the US. Foreign pre-sales are a big part of making, of financing movies these days. This is more so probably for independent producers and the big studios, but this is very interesting the way this works. So essentially when a producer wants to make a movie, and they have only really the essential building blocks at this point. They have They have a script, they might have a writer and a director, or maybe one or two of the major stars, but they don't actually have a completed movie. They need money to get that done. So what do? They engage sales agents in various territories around the world to pre-sell the movie. Pre-sell the right to exhibit it, pre-sell the right to sell DVDs or distribute it on digital platforms, and they essentially get a contract. Once the producer has that contract in hand, that contract serves as collateral that they can then go to banks here in the US to get the money to actually make the movie. The studio then helps assemble the team. Again, those relationships that Epstein was talking about, they can help bring in the writer, director, the actors, and various other people who are going to be essential to bring together the movie. The studios also perform a hugely important function, which is marketing. Marketing is not sort of a small afterthought in the distribution of a major motion pictures. It's an essential part, and the films would essentially never make any money if a lot of money wasn't poured in up front to make audiences aware. There's various ways you can measure this, but one statistic is that the average major studio film costs about $36 million to market before it's even released theatrically. Another rule of thumb you'll sometimes see is that in addition to the actual cost of the production, say it's an additional 50% or so to market that film. And then, of course, the studios have the relationships with the theatrical exhibitors, the TV networks, the online platforms, et cetera. Just a quick look at which of those actual sources, through the licensing of the intellectual property, the copyright, where it actually comes from. And red in this graph is domestic, and blue is worldwide. As you'll see, theatrical, which is sort of the heart of the motion picture industry, is actually a relatively small part of the revenue stream these days. In the US, it's about 25%. In the worldwide, it's about 15%. Home video, of course, is significantly greater. Domestically, that's about 40. Again, this is all enabled by copyright. The reason that motion picture studios are able to get these revenues is because in the absence of copyright, a theater could go and show a movie without paying any license fee. But because under Section 106 of the Copyright Act, the copyright owner enjoys the exclusive right to perform the movie publicly, and there's essentially no piracy in the theatrical marketplace. They're able to work out deals which fund the creation of these movies, and of course make a profit, which is able to be used for the funding of the next movie. This is interesting because it shows you, I think, a bit about the choices that the major studios make in what kind of movies they make and how they actually distribute and market them. So the blue that you see at the bottom is the box office revenues in the US and Canada, and red is international. So you see that over the last 5 years or so, the blue, that's the US and Canada, has stayed pretty much flat at around $10 billion. But international has grown from 29.4 up to about 35.9. And now in 2013, which is the last year we have statistics for, international box office revenues accounted for about 70% of the overall box office revenues. US and Canada only about 30%. So studios are, of course, rational economic actors, and they want to maximize the revenue that they receive from their from licensing out their copyrights. There's lots of different ways potentially they could do it. They could say, you know what, we just finished the movie, and tomorrow we're going to put it on theaters, and we're going to put it on airlines, and distribute it on Netflix, and put it on HBO, et cetera. That's, of course, not the way they traditionally do it, and they still do not do it that way today. Instead, they distribute through what are known as windows. First going to theatrical for the first few months, and to airlines, home video, pay-per-view, et cetera. And there's been a lot of controversy about this system. People say it's outdated. and obsolete in the internet age. But again, there's very sound reasons why they do it. Essentially because the studios all employ really smart MBAs and finance people who crunch the numbers and see that this is the way to maximize their revenue from the huge investments that they and others have put in to making movies, and that they can then use to make the next one. My last slide, again, illustrates that although the windowing system is sort of a dominant part of the landscape today, it's not static, and it probably won't be here in its current form forever. These are statistics compiled by the National Association of Theater Owners, which of course wants to keep the theatrical window as large as possible. But they have put together this very helpful chart, which shows that back in 2000, it looks like it was about 170 days on average for the theatrical window. Now it's right around 130 because of all the pressures from the various new online and other platforms. So studios, again, they have a lot of smart people working in back offices on the big studio lots, trying to figure out exactly how to maximize their revenues. It's been traditionally through windows, but you'll see there's a lot of pressure, and we have a convergence one day down the road between all of the different platforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. We'll take a few minutes now to go down the table and let all the folks who want to listen to the other presentations, if they have any comments or extensions you'd like to add. Curdy, you can start off if you want.
Thank you. Thank you again for organizing this conference that tries to highlight the themes that are common between innovators and creators, different industries that rely on the IPR regime for growth, for innovation, and for continuing to prosper. In our industry, in the mobile wireless communications industry, we've benefited primarily from the patent system because it allowed for strong investment upfront in very risky endeavors. This is very similar to what we heard earlier in the morning about the pharmaceutical industry as well. And I just wanted to highlight that because often there's a perception that the high-tech industry is somehow different from pharmaceuticals, because in the high-tech industry, every product like your phone is covered by hundreds of thousands of patents, versus in the pharma space or drugs, one pill is covered or protected by one patent. So it is well understood in the pharma industry that there is this incentives that needs to be created up front, and it allows for this large risky investment to be made. But it's really also true for the high-tech industry, and this is what I was trying to highlight in my talk, and also highlight that this has led to a very, very competitive space. One of the things I wanted to add was that the standards that I gave an example of, I chose that because most of you carrying your phones today in your pockets right now, or your tablets, are incorporating that standard, the one that I gave an example of. And that's why it's really important for us to think about what that investment, that incentive to invest has enabled us to achieve in this industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce?
Well, I was pleased that you mentioned the Paramount case, because that was a wide-ranging case, but it was also they attacked block booking, and I wanted to, Richard talked about price discrimination, which is a very, very important and ubiquitous way of pricing. I mean, nobody uses linear pricing, so I'm reminded of another famous Coase quote, which it's like, if an economist finds something that he can't understand, he automatically attaches a monopoly explanation. I think that really what is important with respect to conferences like this is to try and get everybody together, and so that the people who do the regulating or study regulation can actually understand what businesses are doing, so we don't just attach some blackboard explanation to it. And, you know, antitrust is replete with, you know, cozying mistakes. You know, we're now experiencing global antitrust, and yeah, it's worse. You know, we had a pharma conference that we put on, and we had a lot of press at that pharma conference, but most of the press was the Canadian, the guy who runs the Canadian competition, said that, you know, he was thinking about these reverse settlements, and he was saying that, you know, people are going to go to jail for engaging in, you know, settle. And I sat there just with my mouth open, and then the next day, my wife said, "Hey, look, all the Competition Law 360 and all these people wrote about your conference." And you know what they said is that, you know, crime in Canada. We do have to sort of think about, you know, antitrust law, because it is sort of the back end, you know, taking away what we give with patent law. And here we always say that, you know, it's not the exercise of lawful monopoly that's an antitrust violation, but it's, you know, conduct or otherwise the generation of monopoly power. And I think a lot of places overseas, you know, completely miss that distinction. So.
Christian?
I'm good.
Ben?
No, I just think it's very interesting hearing representatives from other industries. It's very interesting to me to hear representatives from the other industries talk about their business models. Again, just to emphasize something I said before, so much of the discussion about intellectual property is about when things go wrong. It's about litigation. It's about talking about patent trolls. It's talking about these interesting copyright lawsuits that are going on. It's talking about Aereo, someone who sort of, you know, goes over the line. I think the real story that our industries collectively need to get out is the success stories, not the bad, not where things go wrong and there needs to be litigation, but to explain how copyrights or patents or trademarks or trade secrets actually enable the business models that bring us the cell phones or the tablets or the movies, et cetera.
Okay, we're ready to throw it up for questions, and let me see. Oh, Richard Epstein. Let's get a mic down here, please.
Well, oh, she's bringing one here. Throw it, toss it. Oh, thank you. This is, I think I have many questions, and since I don't know where Bruce and I disagree, I won't ask him one, but I wanted to ask Ben the following question. You put up the model, and you sort of describe basically movies as an everyday addiction for Americans up to about 1968, and then the radical drop in participation. And yet you were stunningly agnostic as to whether or not you thought the Paramount Decree was a good or a bad thing. And so what I would like to do is to know whether it was or was not. And, you know, my presumption is all vertical arrangements are just hunky-dory, independent of specific knowledge about them. So I would be skeptical about that decree unless there was information to the contrary that I'm missing. But were there efficiencies in that studio system, or is the decline in movie attendance simply attributable to the fact of home video, TV, and all sorts of other stuff? I suspect it's a little bit of both, but I'd like to hear what your non-official, non-industry representative view on the subject is.
Sure. Well, to respond to your first question about whether I think it's a good idea, let me just, instead of taking an actual position, let me answer the question this way.
You're so diplomatic.
I know. Let's say this. Our studios, our member studios, have not gone running back into court to try to undo the decree which has been in place for the last 66 years. There's debates about it from time to time about whether that would be a good idea. Let's just say that they've made their peace with the decree that's been in place for.
You are proving the basic proposition that all industry representatives are, shall we say, cowardly when it comes to taking on the government, right? Because, I mean, you got a 40s decree here, you got a 40s decree with respect to ASCAP and BMI, right? And so you have this rapid technological change, and you're still operating under two absolutely decrepit decrees. And the reason nobody will go forward is, in fact, they're afraid of retaliation, I think is what's happening of a sort that they really don't even understand. But there's so many ways that they can get into you. You don't want to figure out what the pathology is looking about. So I will make a statement that I think that this arrangement was at least in part for the decline, and that what happens is the financing becomes much more complicated if you don't have yourself a guaranteed outlet. And since the film industry is one in which the proportions are relatively constant, that is, you make a film, you kind of know what your audiences are going to be, that the vertical integration there is not going to cause the kinds of problems that you get when you've got one industry which is relatively stable in what it does and another one which is wildly phlegmatic, so that the integrated model probably makes sense. You don't have to answer that question.
It wasn't a question.
We're in the back.
That's okay. I would like to hear other statements or questions, please.
Question for Curdy and a quick one for Ben. The common refrain is that you show all these healthy market developments and so on, and the common refrain would be, but it could be better. Could be better if there wasn't that whole. What is the way we can answer the people who say from the FTC, it could be better? There's no holdup, there's good development, but it could be better. That's for you. For Ben, the dynamics of that decline of the Windows release, could you explain the tendency, the timing, why it's shrinking? It used to be over 6 months in the 80s, and what's the fundamental economic reason for that decline? Curdy, you want to go?
Okay, yeah, I'll start. You're right. We hear this often, and I will say this, that whenever in the past antitrust law has, been developing in the United States, in the past, whenever we have tried to find some tools to implement, we've tried to find some evidence, right? We've used some tools to say, to try to measure the health of an industry. But in the current landscape where these patents related to standards and technology are being subject to these intense scrutiny, there has been no evidence that has been offered for that concern. So I think we should turn the challenge around and say, show us where is the competitive harm, because whether we look at revenues, whether we look at profit margins, we look at market entry or market exit. These are charts I haven't shown you, but they will be in the paper. Or the number of products that have been offered related to these technologies in the marketplace they've skyrocketed. We all know this anecdotally, right? You have many more choices as consumers. Prices have fallen. So where is any evidence of any competitive harm? If there is.
Oh yeah, or worse.
And I think we'll be hard pressed to find an example of an industry that has grown as significantly and as fast as this industry. So maybe we should think of some hypotheticals as examples to humor ourselves and compare that to this industry and show that the revenue growth is smaller, lower, and it won't be hard to find.
Ben?
Sure, just quickly, and just to preface this, the antitrust lawyer in me just wants to remind everybody that these windows are the result of individual negotiations between the studios and the distributors. I mean, you'll see even in that chart, although there's a lot of commonality, each of the studios has a different line that are the results of their own negotiations with the exhibitors. But why is there the general downward slope? I mean, I think the biggest and most obvious reason is the rise of the internet, which probably started on a consumer scale around 97, 98. Consumers want to watch movies on their own time, on their own platform, when they want, where they want, as we like to say. And the studios recognize that and would like to, where it makes economic sense for them, release it to them sooner. Of course, they have long-standing, many decades-long relationships with the theatrical exhibitors who don't want that, who want to keep that exclusivity for as long as possible. And these are, again, of course, the result of negotiations. Various studios have tried over the last decade or so various experiments where they would, say, release it, they would announce they want to release it theatrically, and then either the same day or maybe even a few weeks later, release it through some new distribution platform directly into the home. And all I can say is read Variety and The Hollywood Reporter to see what the theatrical exhibitor's reaction is at. They generally, each individually will come out and say, we're not going to show the movie if you do that.
Richard, did you have a quick reaction to Curdy? I thought you wanted to say something.
To that, Sean?
No, to her discussion.
Yes, I do, actually.
Well, I'm just trying to make this more entertaining.
But entertaining, yes. Informative, no. Right? No, I think what Kirti said. The Harold Demsetz wrote this famous paper a long time ago about the nirvana fallacy, in which what you do is you find that there's some ideal world out there, then the real world that you have never quite meets up to it, and then you say you have to reform it. So, I mean, to give you but one historical example, people used to talk about how wonderful a workman's compensation system would be because you wouldn't have these huge numbers of questions you have under the tort law, and you wouldn't have to write a 6-volume treatise. Well, 30 years later, you have the workman's compensation system, and you got yourself a 6-volume treatise anyhow. I mean, because old problems disappear, new problems come. But I think the answer that I would give, apart from the one that she gave, which was correct, is that, you know, when you're starting to say this, you're assuming that all forms of reform are free of public choice risks. And so that what happens is you've got a system which is improving more rapidly than any other. You could make it better, but if you're trying to bet the odds, you could also make it worse. And so what you want to say is, please don't tell me that there's some way in which you could make it better. Please tell me the way in which you want to make it better, and force them to essentially speak about the kinds of practices that they don't like. I mean, one of the things that I think Kirti can do, if not here, then somewhere else, because Qualcomm has always been a leader in this, is to actually explain how it is that when you take these FRAND organizations to give yourself G4 standards, they're internally organized in an effort to give a series of disclosures and a series of bargain arrangements so that avoid the holdout. That chart that she put up saying huge numbers of attendees and very small numbers of actually standard guys, she didn't link it up with what I think would be very important. That this means you sort of have to go before a kind of a parliament, a Sanhedrin, a council of the elders. And so what you do is even the people who don't contribute the technology contribute input to the technology, which allows you to figure out what you're going to do and take into account your downstream users. That's what you're saying, I think. And you know, I've never seen that point made in this actual literature, where for the most part when people tend to talk about it, they just assume it's a smoke-filled room in which the big guys get together and figure out how to parcel up monopoly profits. And so this is a form of basically invited public participation, which essentially sharpens the way and allows you to anticipate your downstream market. I think, you know, that's something that's worth saying, and I'm not aware of it being in the literature, Kirti, so I would hope that you would stress it when you write up the remarks.
Stanley Woods.
Yeah, this is for Bruce. If I understood your last slide, and I'm not sure I did, so correct me if I'm wrong, you were defending the current system with ASCAP and BMI in the pricing and saying it has some advantages. Is that right?
Well, no, as to old technology, I mean, it you know, I think it still has. So if you want to collect from bars and restaurants for playing the radio, then, you know, it still has. But what all of the publishers want to do is just get out of that. And I think there's two reasons. One, they want to get out from under the antitrust decrees. And that's the easy way to do it. Say, we want to get out of these organizations which are subject to the decrees. And second, it's a lot easier for the reasons Richard mentioned to, you know, monitor, collect, and transact with those organizations.
Okay, well, I guess I maybe had misinterpreted somewhat, but I thought that perhaps you were implying that the lump sum payment, which is how it works with the
The blanket
PROs,
license? Yeah.
has certain economic advantages over a pay-per-use type of system,
Maybe-
which is what Richard, I thought, was
Yeah.
suggesting, because even though this morning I said I don't like to talk about non-ravelrous goods anymore.
Right,
But
right,
it is a
right.
non-ravelrous good, and having a per-use payment would be inefficient compared to a lump sum payment if it doesn't deter the amount
Yeah,
that's being used.
The important point, I mean, so the technology, I mean, you know, if you think about how songwriters made money, you know, years ago, is they sold sheet music. You know, how much sheet music is sold today? A lot less, right? Sound recording artists made money by selling vinyl records, right? And you know, those, I teach this case professional real estate. It's about sham litigation in class. And finally a couple years ago, somebody said, Professor Kobayashi, what the hell is a video disc? You know, like, and so, you know, one of the things is that was really how they got like the metering aspect, and you got residuals, you got volume-based payments based on volume, and you know, I'm not saying that, you know, the blanket license, you know, is the best way to go, but at one time it was thought that, you know, this was actually a form of payment that saved a lot of transactions costs. But I agree, if you go to the direct, I mean, I think a lot of the frustration is to get out of sort of the current state of pricing, and it may just be the constraints from the consent decree, it also could be the form, because they're very constrained on what they can do.
Okay, if I can have, I guess, maybe one more second. Because then there was this question of, because one is the lump sum,
Right.
okay, where it's good to not be paying per use. It's good not to have the radio stations economize on their use of music because of the fact that it's non-rivalrous. It's zero cost of using as much as you want since it's a non-rivalrous good, so you should be treated as if the price is zero. And a lump sum does that because the marginal use doesn't cost you anything more. So a radio station will use
Yeah.
the right amount of music under the lump sum and the wrong amount of music under Richard's scenario. Okay, I hesitate to do that.
Well, you know-
but the other thing is the way they set the lump sum.
Right,
It's
it's some
terrible.
form of two-part tariff, right? Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, you know, if you're gonna do a two-part tariff and you can figure out how much the first part is, and yeah, maybe it's efficient to set the Richard.
Look, I mean, this is back to the marginal cost controversy of Ronald Coase. And you have to know what that lump sum is, and the lump sum choice will influence the incentives on overall production. And so the question is whether you can say abstractly one is better than or not. The answer, I think, is no. To give you an illustration, when they did bridges in the 19th century, which have a similar characteristic, very high front-end cost, very low variable cost, close to zero, they kind of used a lump sum and gave you a right to charge a tariff for a certain period of time and then put it into the public domain, which suggests that there is no unique single dominant strategy with respect to dealing non-rivalrous goods which have high costs of production. So, I mean, I don't know what the right answer is, but I think these guys in a competitive market have a better incentive to figure it out than either Bruce or me. Now, you maybe know all this stuff, Stan, but I don't.
Other questions? Yes, we got back here in the middle.
I have a question for Kristen about patent trolls. So I haven't made a study of it as you have, but I think a lot of people would draw the line and define patent trolls around the idea of firms that make a business of not engaging in the creation of new copyrightable or patentable inventions, but making a business from litigation or the threat of litigation. And the frustration for those of us who work in big music or big film is that we use litigation to sort of clear the underbrush for the continued respect of our new products, whereas the trolls are out there using litigation basically just to create a monopoly around their old invention, which is and they're not feeding that profit into the creation of new works. So obviously they have the right to do it. That's what the law gives them. But I would like to know your views on whether you think it's good in society to give them that right, because you obviously don't like calling them patent trolls. You like them or you respect them, whereas I think on the other side of the line, we regard them as with a great deal of irritation.
Disdain, perhaps? Okay. So the first thing I will say is that your definition that you suggest hasn't been used by anybody. Either it's they don't make something, or they don't make something, or they don't make something. Not that I think that that's a good line of distinction, but in the various studies that we're looking at, yeah, some of them have that flavor of, oh, they make their money off of litigation, but there's very rarely any discussion about whether or not invention and innovation is part of their business model at all. That's not usually brought up. The firms I studied still are, so I yay. So they don't fit in your definition, so it's okay. But how do I feel about firms that do that? I like them. I like patent trolls. I like licensing-based business models for a couple of reasons. I don't think that even if you are not inventing and innovating and you are asserting your patent rights, that you are necessarily causing anything bad to happen. There certainly are companies that do that, but what's bad about them, what we don't like about them, is that they're asserting invalid patents or they're engaging in abusive practices with wicked cease and desist letters. Sure, all of that is bad. Yeah, but there's also firms that make stuff that do that. We wouldn't call them patent trolls, but they're engaging in the same bad behavior. So I do not think there's anything wrong with a company, even if they don't do any new research or innovation, in asserting their patent rights, so long as they're engaging in appropriate behavior. I think what we need to target is the bad behavior, not the company by category.
Bad behavior is
Well, bad behavior that I'm talking about is bad behavior is infringement, yes. But I would view it more as the asserting invalid patents, sending abusive cease and desist letters. Those companies, I think, are problematic, and that's the behavior that's usually attributed to licensing-based business models and trolls, but they're not the one and the same. So let's stop the bad behavior, not crush companies based on their category.
I certainly endorse your characterization as troll being linked to behavior, but I would also just like to add that people always indicate that the NPE or the aggregator doesn't add anything to the economy. Well, we're liquidity providers. We certainly do add things to the economy because we purchase things on the secondary market and then leverage them for further exploitation. That's an important service that you need to have in a rational market. Imagine if there were no secondary market for cars. Right?
Or banks.
So I think that that's something that is often missed in this argument about the business model of NPEs, aggregators, PAs.
You'll be happy to know it's in my paper. I just didn't get that in the talk, but thank you.
price discovery. Price discovery.
Okay. Did you have a question right here in the middle?
I did. I had a comment, not really a question.
Okay.
I happen to represent the Treasury, the king of the patent trolls, according to Senator Sherman. And it's just ridiculous. They've engaged in litigation in enforcing their patents almost since the day that the patents were issued. They haven't lost yet.
Who was that?
Data Treasury.
Yeah, I know, it's my client. but you talk.
Your client too?
Yeah.
Oh, we share a client. How about that?
And
But
then Sherman goes after us because we told.
yeah, I mean, Schumer spent a lot of time in the Senate denigrating Data Treasury. Data Treasury, as I said, they've been very, very successful in licensing. I've worked now on 368 post-grant proceedings challenging the Data Treasury patents. There are two main patents. And as far as I know, the three IPRs got kicked by the board because the IPR cited to 2,000 pages of reference material, and the board said, we don't go there. We don't look at 2,000 pages of reference material. And I've worked on now, I'm cleaning up the last of, I think it's 6 covered business method proceedings, the response to the proceeding per se. And win or lose there, their record is not one of someone who's got a patent which they clearly recognize as being invalid, but they've run around and enforced it. And when they enforce it, they win. They get settlements, they get verdicts. So as the king of the patent trolls and one of the two councils in the room that represent them, I'm fairly good with working for it.
It's really interesting, the notion of the shifting definition of trolls. Over the last couple of years, there's now this phenomenon which people refer to as copyright trolls. There was a very interesting article in the New Yorker a few months ago about an entity called Malibu Media, which is responsible for filing, don't quote me on this, but we can look it up in the article. I think it was something like 1/3 of all of the copyright cases filed in the US last year were filed. Malibu Media was the plaintiff. And they're universally referred to in the press, the sort of tech press, which hates these guys, as copyright trolls. Well, love them or hate them, or approve or disapprove of their litigation tactics, they are a legitimate adult film producer. Okay? They make porn, and they sue a lot of people who illegally download it. And again, they're referred to as trolls, but they're not some licensing entity which just simply licenses in others' copyrights and then goes file a lot of these lawsuits. They produce porn, and then they go and sue people who infringe it. They're still called trolls.
We've got a mic right behind you, Richard.
Yeah, I want to mention something about data treasury, because one of the things that you have to understand, and it ties in with what I said about Kirti's thing before, is you don't know who's wearing the white or the black hat in these cases. But in addition to all the litigation that you fought, there was the Check 21 legislation that was proposed, which I worked on. And what the government, what the proponents of this legislation proposed was that for certain kinds of purposes, mainly their own in bank-type transactions, they could use a patent that was protected, and you didn't get damages, you didn't get injunctions, and you couldn't get legal expenses to do it. And the argument was that this was perfectly okay because you could still use the thing for others, and so therefore this was not a taking. And there was actually some serious traction on this, notwithstanding the fact that in each and every case that this thing had been litigated, we had won cleanly. When that was beaten back, then they came back, and the re-examination provisions were essentially designed in the AIA in an effort to try to get these guys again through another situation, and also the same thing with respect to the business method patent. And the justifications that were sort of put forward is in the interest of national security, not to ship all these checks around by airplanes where they could get lost, so therefore the government in the world now needs to have this stuff patent-free. That was the way in which it was put forward in the Senate, to which I think the obvious response is it's precisely because it's such a valuable contribution that you ought to pay for it and not get it for zero. And this was the worst case of rent-seeking. In fact, when the banks came forward the second time, they looked at their legislation they put forward the first time. That legislation, in fact, would have applied to their own patents in this particular space. So what they did is they then changed the legislation to say, oh, it only applies to outside entities. Any bank that makes a patent in this particular class is going to be fully protected because that turns out to be us. And so this is a classic public choice story, and a rather ugly one at that.
We have time for one more question or comment.
I will just quickly say that we will be talking about patent licensing and related issues on our panels tomorrow. So if you enjoyed this conversation, please come back.
Okay, we'll declare victory for this panel. Please join me in thanking all the panelists.